Let's start this episode with a little guessing game. I'm going to give you 3 descriptors, 3 flavour notes for a certain coffee. And from those 3 flavour notes only, I want you to try and deduce the identity of the coffee. So the origin, the cultivar or the variety, the processing, perhaps the roast also. Those 3 flavour notes are orange, raspberry, and milk chocolate. Hello and welcome to Coffee with Maxwell. Now this episode is about a topic, a concept in coffee that's been on my mind a lot lately. How useful are flavour notes really? What are they for? What do they mean for accessibility? What do they mean for communication? And how do we actually use them across the coffee industry and with our customers? Now in many ways, I've always been a proponent of flavour notes. In our coffee shop, Colonna & Smalls in Bath, we used them for many years and found them really useful as a way to say, hey, we're doing something different with coffee here. A board full of unique coffees and flavour notes could trigger a conversation. But I've also seen lots of negatives to flavour notes. And the more I think about them recently, and the fact that maybe the reason we used to use them, we don't need to use them in the same way anymore, has led ultimately to the question, at our coffee roastery anyway, should we just get rid of flavour notes? Okay, so let's start with what we actually mean by flavour notes. You know, it may be easy to have a giggle at a customer that walks in and sees a flavour note and says, oh, are they nuts in that? Because I can't have those. Or, oh no, I don't want a coffee with added flavour when I see raspberry or strawberry. But it's a fair point, right? It's actually very understandable. We're using other food and drink reference points to describe a coffee. So we're not really describing that coffee, we're describing that coffee using other non-coffee related things. For example, a Kenyan coffee doesn't actually taste of blackcurrant or blackberry. It tastes of a Kenyan coffee. But why do we use blackcurrant or blackberry? Well, because we're trying to find the nearest reference point, the nearest description that is relatable to someone who's never tasted that coffee. And we're making the assumption that everyone has tasted blackcurrants and blackberries. Important point here, this is one of the challenges at barista competitions around the world. Those assumptions about reference points don't hold up around the world. Different cultures, different countries. What does banana mean in one country to another? Sweeter in some countries, but also just things that in certain cultures and countries you just wouldn't eat or drink. It's just not part of the menu. So that actually falls down completely at that point. You try to use something that you think is a commonality, something people can relate to, and it's the opposite. It's something they've never tasted. Anyway, that's an aside. And so that's what we're doing there. It's a very genuine, earnest attempt to try and give the customer some guidance as to why they might choose one coffee over another. And this comes, I think, from a really good place. But I think there's 2 main reasons, and they're kind of like one reason all tangled in together, as to why a lot of the times flavour notes don't work. And maybe, I'm just plucking a number out of thin air, but maybe 20% of the time they work, and 80% of the time they don't work. And even worse than that, they potentially hinder accessibility, hinder actually learning, especially for the customer, what their preferences are and what they might want to order or not order next time. So the first thing we have to talk about with flavour notes is out of all the ways you could describe coffee, they are possibly, I think they probably are, the most subjective part of flavour description. I was joking with my team, but it feels a bit mean, that I wanted to give them all the same coffee, but independently with no one else around, across the cafe and the roastery, and film them and see what they say. I know the flavour notes will not be the same. Now there might be some commonality because we're describing coffee with each other so often that we learn from each other what descriptions we use. And actually, if you have a core team at the cafe or the roastery over time, they actually get quite calibrated. And what it means is that they know from their experience with the other members of the team that when a coffee tastes a certain way, we use roughly these flavour notes. And then some of our customers who come in and guess the coffee on the board get quite good at that also. But do they get good at that because they've learned flavour notes for the coffee industry, or because they've learned that our team will use certain flavour notes with certain coffees? Anyway, the second main reason I think flavour notes are a problem is kind of tied to the first one, which is consistency and implementation of those flavour notes, or that lexicon or language. And what I kind of mean there is flavour notes in coffee particularly appear to have no real basis of implementation, no system or mechanisation for these are the flavour notes we use for coffees from these regions. It really just seems to be, taste the coffee, what do you think it tastes like? Turn to the person next to you, what do you think it tastes like? And then you end up coming up with some flavour notes, right? And then they go on a bag. But what actually happens when something goes on a bag is, if the flavour notes become one of the main ways that people choose the coffee, do they become accurate flavour notes anymore? Or do they become a sales pitch for the coffee? Do they become embellished to the point where they're actually less accurate, but they help sell a bag of coffee? I was just actually at the shop where I was trying to film this video because my house has a draft in it, and you can probably hear it in the background now. And I thought maybe I'll go down and film at the shop, but they're having a sourdough party, which obviously I said was great and I won't disturb, so I've come back to have another go. But they were joking that, you know, one of the Brazilian coffees that we have, they always put the flavour note peanut butter up, which people are drawn to and it sells. But actually, if you gave people 3 cups of coffee, would that be their favourite? Possibly not. When I got into coffee, I thought that maybe I naively thought that there was a correct or legitimate way to taste coffee and learn flavour notes and use flavour notes. And a lot of that I think comes with the way they get utilised, which really frustrates me in hindsight for a subjective element of coffee, by individuals in the room or individuals in companies. This idea that the flavour note is something that is a truth, that if you're good at tasting, you'll pick out, right? So I remember going to a tasting really early and someone being like, orange blossom, rosemary, glazed cherry. They weren't saying, do you think that tastes of those things? Or, I think maybe a bit like orange blossom to me, what do you think? They were saying, it tastes of those things, and if you can't taste those things, you're an idiot. That was the subtext, right? And this really brings me on to the danger of flavour notes, which is the exclusivity, the lack of inclusivity, the lack of approachability. So on the one hand, we can use flavour notes to try and, get people engaged with coffee, and we can get them to, use some reference points that they have to really, the subtext being, well, look, these coffees are different, they come from different parts of the world, and they taste different, and we're just trying to describe them differently. Do you want to take part in this? What do you think it tastes like? That's the positive side. The negative side is, these are the flavour notes. If you know how to taste coffee, you'd pick up on these. And I think a lot of people, a lot of customers view it this way. And what happens is they read the label and they go, okay, yeah, orange blossom, glazed cherry, rosemary, long, playful finish. Whew. Okay, let's see. And then they taste the coffee and they're like, nope, maybe I'm just not a good taster. I mean, there's maybe something a little floral there, a bit of fruitiness, I guess. But I wouldn't say that I definitely get these. They don't resonate with me. And that's at the point when the customer then thinks that they're stupid or that they don't know how to taste, which is just not true. So putting to one side for a moment the fact that flavour notes in and of themselves are a reference point, they're not an actual descriptor of that particular coffee, they're an analogy, some kind of comparison. Put that to one side. It feels like in coffee we use a pretty narrow range, right? And people aren't really sure what a positive flavour note is or a negative flavour note. I mean, it's a bit like the joke somebody said to me about sustainable coffee. You never see a bag of coffee saying unsustainable coffee. You never see a flavour note that is not a nice flavour note. And I think, yes, when you've been in coffee quite a long time, you can kind of go, okay, those flavour notes, I think that probably means this, right? I think somebody messaged me saying when they see cocoa, they think actually it's a bit bitter. Or they see tea-like, maybe it's a bit woody. So going, okay, maybe you're using a flavour note to describe something negative. But just in general, I would say the lexicon, the range of language we use is quite narrow. So for example, interesting processes, exactly the interaction with the bacteria, the microbes, the yeast, the fermentation, are creating some unique flavours, and we just don't really have a language that communicates them, right? And the same with the geisha. I said to you, okay, there's something special and sparkling and complex, and it's just like, wow, it's stunning. That coffee is stunning. And then having to sort of dumb that down to, jasmine, peach, lemonade. It's sort of not doing it justice, But we all become so reliant on flavour notes. We're sat there looking at our coffee bags going, the other day, someone I work with said to me, why do we always use 3 flavour notes? And I was like, yeah, good point. I mean, I know why. The room on the label, more than one description, it's a middle ground. But yeah, one coffee could just have 1 flavour note, potentially, and one coffee could have 6. And I think it really hit home to me when my mum wanted me to send her more of a capsule. So I've spent years trying to get my mum to drink better coffee. And not because, not against her will. Let's be clear here. When I would go down and make her a coffee, she would be like, oh, that's delicious. But getting into the brewing and the grinding and the weighing, no, wasn't going to win over the instant Nescafe. And then we did capsules, and that did win, and fully engaged. And she phoned me up and said, I really like the blackberry one. I want more of the blackberry one. And I'm like, okay, which one was that? It was, where's the coffee from? Oh, the blackberry one. Right, yes. Do you know the colour of the box? At least something else to help me. Now this is hilarious when you think about it, right? Because the flavour notes that we're saying is how the customer chooses. In this case, I don't even know what coffee it is, right? So I'm sure I could go and do some research and find out across our 8 SKUs or 10 SKUs, which ones have we used blackberry for. Maybe if it was a bit more, certain flavour notes, I've got to be fair, and this is my 80-20 point, are actually more useful. If you said to me, it's really floral, I like the floral one, well, there's less floral coffees in coffee. If we're actually honestly using floral as a strong descriptor, or flowery, aromatic, and I'm thinking, okay, yeah, it could be an Ethiopian wash coffee, or it could be a geisha. Strawberry or blueberry, traditionally used for really sort of ripe fermented natural coffees, certain Ethiopian naturals, etc. So maybe it's that. And so there's a few examples where the flavour notes work quite well. And I actually think when I first got into coffee in Australia, it was through a positive flavour note experience, right? I was given a coffee and told it was from a region, and I was given a flavour note of strawberry, and that really worked. I got it. And that was exciting for me, and I was engaged. I was like, wow, I got the flavour note. This is so interesting. And this is something about inclusivity that came off the back of the cinnamon video I did, which was about the cinnamon flavours in coffee and whether they're added or not. A couple of people got in touch with me and said, the reason they like the cinnamon coffees is because of how inclusive they are. And what they mean by that, they explained, was people can taste that coffee. We can say, taste this, it's got notes of cinnamon. And people get it every time. And people are like, oh, I got it, I finally got a flavour note. But let's just think about that for a minute. Does that not tell us how broken our use of flavour notes is? If we've done such a bad job with them, right, that we're basically encouraging the addition of flavours just to provide flavour notes that actually deliver. And of course, there's always going to be an element of exclusivity to something that's complex and you have to learn about, right? I often say this, right? Most people who will drink specialty coffee will never be an expert in it, but not because they cannot be, but because they're living their life doing other things and they've chosen other hobbies. And it's a bit like, I'm not an expert in wine. I'm sure I could be if I dedicated the time and energy to it, but I'm not, so I won't be. So as somebody dipping their toes, I'm looking to try and figure out enough for me to enjoy it and explore it. And what that means is, a lot of people won't get to that stage. And I think this is the same with a lot of what we're doing in coffee. We want to follow it down the rabbit hole as far as it goes, and I think that's a good thing, right? But we also want to figure out, if you're only going to give people, dip your feet in, what are you going to dip your feet in with? And obscure, relative, subjective flavour notes don't feel like the place to dip your feet in. In fact, if you're going to taste an interesting coffee tomorrow, what do you really want to learn about it? You want to know why it tastes interesting, right? In fact, you want to know why any coffee tastes the way it does. Flavour notes don't give you that. They are a bad attempt at describing the profile of the character of the coffee, but they don't tell you where the flavour came from. Even though that's the information we're worried about giving people or presenting to people, because if they have no reference, it's potentially exclusive or overwhelming. It's actually the most useful information for everyone involved. If my mum alternatively didn't have flavour notes on that box, she would have told me that, her favourite coffee was this washed Kenyan coffee in the short capsule. That was more useful for her to know in her experience of coffee. If she's not buying my coffee again and my, or my team's subjective use of flavour notes, she has some information that she can use elsewhere. It also means that I can actually find her the capsules that she's asking for. And I think this is really where I'm ending up on flavour notes, which is they're not a bad thing, they're fun, they shouldn't be taken too seriously. This brings me back onto my regular competition bashing, which I managed to get into probably every other episode, is coffee competitions use accuracy of flavour descriptors as one of the key metrics for success in a competition. This is nuts, right? I know that if I took all 4 judges and I separated them into separate rooms and I said, what do you think that tastes of? What do you think that tastes of? What do you think that tastes of? They would not all tell you the same thing, right? So it's a strange thing to focus the conversation around. But I also understand it. I understand where it comes from. I think if we're a little bit more careful in how we use flavour notes, i.e., a coffee like this should only have this range of flavour notes, they might be a bit more useful. So I was shown a Peruvian coffee by one of my team this week who said, look, I tasted this coffee, it was nice, it was smooth, chocolatey, a few fruit notes in there, I think it might have had an interesting process. And then they showed me the label, and on the label it said caramelized pineapple, it said strawberry gummy bears, and I mean it went on, and it was crazy. Out of all the flavour notes you could have chosen for that coffee, the ones that were maybe stretch goals, shall we call it, that maybe you could get, were the predominant ones. And that's back to the sales point, because that makes the coffee sound more exciting and more sellable, right? I do think that if you actually create scenarios where you test the practical use of flavour notes beyond a flamboyant sales pitch for a particular coffee, you'll find that a lot of the time they're not particularly useful. But what excites me about where coffee's at is when we started our shop a long time ago, 11, 12 years ago, it really did feel like the only way to start the conversation. Trying to start with origin, variety, cultivar, processing, roast. I mean, the roast one's interesting, we'll come back to that in a sec, but it was just very difficult. What's exciting is, I think now that most customers who are drawn to interesting coffee, quality coffee, specialty coffee, whatever you want to call it, have a pretty reasonable base understanding. They've tasted a few different origins, they've been through this a few times, and actually it's better for them and for us to focus on the identity of the coffee, its provenance, and that to become a better marker for how the coffee tastes, right? I see all sorts of other things happening with flavour notes, like contextuality. You have 3 coffees on and you end up using 3 similar flavour notes, and then you scratch your head and you go, well, we can't use the same flavour notes for 3 coffees. So you start changing them just to be different to that other coffee, not because you think they're the best flavour notes for that coffee. And really, when I ask one of my members of the team, when I give them a coffee and I say, what do you think of it? Do I really want to know if they're going to give me a flavour note that I recognise too? Not really. What I'm really interested in, the real value there, is the ability to decide whether it's good or not. Okay, so are there any obvious faults, any obvious problems? At the same time, I'm also surprised how well scoring works. For all you can moan about scoring, and really it doesn't tell you anything about the character. I mean, when you've been in coffee and you have a broad enough experience, you know that a 90-point coffee is going to be pretty aromatic. You know it's going to be fruity, sweet, clean, complex. You know that. But what about 85? What do you know about if I sell you, here's an 85-point coffee, what do you know about the flavour of that coffee? So that's where scoring falls down. But scoring is quite accurate. I mean, again, who's scoring it and why are they scoring it? You know, if you're putting your own scores on your own bags to sell them, then I'm not sure about that. You know, this is 94-point coffee. It's the same problem with the transparency information. And I say, you know, where's the information from? They're like, oh, you know, all the transparency's there. I'm like, who wrote that? They're like, we did. I'm like, oh, the company that's selling me the product. So the sales pitch is the transparency. Sort of similar with a score. You know, you better think your coffee's great. You're selling it. So it's a similar situation. And so scoring is interesting. Is it relevant for a customer? Maybe for the really expensive coffees, but whose score do you take? You know, do you take yours or do you get someone else to score it? Has it been through a competition? Classic. You know, I remember when I first did my Q graders, and Tracy Allen, who was running the course, quite rightly said, you know, we have a score for a coffee at a competition. A roaster buys that coffee. They sit it on the shelf. They can't sell it for a year. They finally roast it and sell it, and they use the score that the coffee was given when it was harvested, and it doesn't taste that good anymore. So it's a bit different to wine in a bottle, isn't it? Or a beer that got a certain gold award. And on this point, you can't fail to mention the sheer amount of obstacles that are in the way to replicate that exact profile. The profile that was tasted at the roastery when the coffee's flavour notes were defined, written down. You know, if the water's different, it has a huge impact on that flavour profile. If the brewing method, the grind is different, it all has an impact on the flavour profile. So yeah, we're looking to find ways to describe things to our customers. And I'm not saying there's one way to do that. I guess what this episode is about is the reliance on flavour notes is problematic. They don't really work very well. If you're watching this and you felt ostracised by flavour notes, well, don't be, okay? They are not something that the elite are all aligned and calibrated on. Yeah, really, a really interesting skill, which we don't test in something like a cup tasters competition or anything like this, is can you pick out where the coffee's from? Can you tell me by tasting that coffee something about the identity of it and where it's from? You know, I think really that's the more valuable thing for all of us to focus on. You know, when I got into coffee, I was like, okay, well, I really like these coffees. Does everybody else really like them? Is my taste match the industry? And that's something interesting to learn about yourself. You know, when you learn, okay, well, these really high scoring coffees, they have these attributes, and you might decide they're not your favorite, but you still know that they are, as far as the industry is concerned, a high quality coffee, right? So there's a difference between preference and quality. I don't want to get too philosophical here. There's always been this debate in coffee about subjective v objective. My argument for quite a long time has been that what I see in coffee is a lot of subjective experiences, individual subjective experiences that come together and collectively create an objective structure. Now there's range in there. Two people will get given the same coffee and score it differently. Two people will have different preferences on what's better or not. But interestingly, as a coffee industry, there's quite a lot of agreement. It's quite interesting. I'd say there's very little agreement on flavour notes though. So right back full circle, the flavour notes seem to be particularly bad at communicating, whether to customers or to different roasteries or at barista competitions. Flavour notes are a problem. They should be taken with a huge pinch of salt and they shouldn't be relied upon. If we come back to the beginning of this episode, when I asked you to guess the coffee, well, I think you probably realise now, based on this episode, that it could be any number of coffees. I was thinking of a particular Colombian coffee, but it could have easily been a coffee from El Salvador, a coffee from Peru, a coffee from Uganda, a coffee from Tanzania. That is the flaw in flavour notes. Okay, and from my personal experience, when I taste coffee now, what my brain is doing is thinking, well, how good is it? That I'll pick up any faults straight away. Is there any problem with it? problem with the green coffee? Is there any bagginess? Is there a problem with the roast? And I'm thinking, basically, how good is it? That's what my brain's doing, all that stuff. And then flavour notes come after. Oh, okay, I've got to describe it and put it on a bag. I guess I'd use these flavour notes, you know? And yes, like I said at the beginning, there are a few exceptions. Where you go, wow, it really does taste of strawberry. I remember we had a lot from Rwanda that tasted like that a few years ago, Kalimbi lot, natural lot. Or, you know, the geisha, and you're just like, oh, it's so perfumed, it's so flowery. And I think that's great. When it stands out to you so much that that's the only way you could describe that coffee at that moment in time, that's awesome. But more often than not, there isn't a flavour note to fit. And there's a weird psychological process of abstracting flavour notes across onto coffee flavour profiles. You end up in this position where I think a lot of people tasting coffee, whether it's the customer, importer or the roaster, has a bit of the feeling of an imposter syndrome. You're like, I think this tastes of clementine. And the other person goes, yeah, it does taste clementine. Yeah, okay, great. Right? So what does this mean? What's my point to this whole episode? Well, I think I'm going to try and get rid of flavour notes in the projects that we're doing. I just think flavour notes suck most of the time. Like, they really do. They're not used consistently, they're highly subjective, they don't give you that much information to progress in your coffee journey or to be able to make decisions next time. They're just a wild west of flavours chucked on. They're tied into marketing, they're tied into sort of ego and being right about something as subjective as coffee. And thank you very much for watching. Talking of tasting, I'm currently organising a virtual tasting on my Patreon where I hope to dig in to some of these concepts and how we discuss and communicate coffee. You know, because one of the things I love about coffee more than anything is the ability to have a shared tasting experience, which is probably why flavour notes annoy me so much, because a lot of the time they don't help that shared experience. So please do support me on my Patreon if you can, or like, share and subscribe on this channel.